Vivienne understands the life I want now." Those were the words Julian Ravenscroft, Duke of Ravensmere, said to his wife of 8 years, standing inside the very home Adelaide had kept alive with her own 2 hands. He brought his mistress into her house. He expected tears. He expected her to stay. Instead, Adelaide Fairmont Ravensmere walked out, and 100 tenants refused to pay a single shilling without her. If you've ever been taken for granted by someone who thought you had nowhere else to go, stay with us. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from today? The morning Adelaide Fairmont married Julian Ravenscroft. The sky over Hampshire was the color of pewter and old roses, heavy with the kind of light that made everything look like a painting someone hadn't quite finished. She was 26 years old, dressed in ivory silk that her mother had quietly altered twice because Adelaide kept losing weight in the months before the wedding. Not from happiness, but from the particular kind of anxiety that comes when a woman marries a man she respects before she fully understands him. Julian had been 32, tall in the way that made rooms feel smaller, dark-haired with the color of deep water. Not the romantic kind of dark water, but the kind you find at the bottom of a well, where light doesn't reach without effort. He was already the Duke of Ravensmere by then, already the man people whispered about at dinner tables across the north of England. The Duke who turned ruins into fortune. That was what they called him. And it wasn't false. His father had left him an estate burdened with debt coal mines that were barely producing, and a reputation held together mostly by the family name and the age of the stone walls. Julian had taken all of it, every crumbling piece, and rebuilt it into something that made other dukes quietly envious. He hadn't done it by inheriting a talent for comfort. He'd done it by working with the kind of focused intensity that left no room for softness. Adelaide had understood that about him from the beginning. It was in some ways what had drawn her to him. What she hadn't understood was the difference between a man who was building toward something and a man who had already decided what mattered and where she ranked on that list. On their wedding day, Julian had taken her hands before the ceremony while the guests were still filing into the chapel, and looked at her with something in his face she had never entirely forgotten. "You are the one person who sees me before the title." She had believed him. More than believed him, she had built 8 years of her life on that sentence. The Fairmont family was not poor. They were what the English aristocracy called comfortable with influence, which meant their land in Hampshire was well maintained. Their name carried weight in certain rooms, and Lady Beatrice Fairmont had spent 30 years cultivating relationships across 3 counties that no amount of money could have purchased directly. Adelaide had grown up understanding that power was not always loud. Sometimes it was a letter written at the right moment. Sometimes it was remembering a steward's daughter's name at a county dinner. Sometimes it was simply staying in the room when everyone else walked out. These were not lessons anyone had sat down to teach her. They were things she had absorbed way children absorb language, by watching, by listening, by being present when adults thought she wasn't paying attention. When she married Julian and arrived at Ravensmere Estate in Yorkshire, she arrived with no illusions about what the estate needed. It was magnificent in the way that old power is always magnificent. Slightly intimidating, slightly in need of repair, and carrying within its walls the accumulated weight of everyone who had ever lived or worked there. The tenants on Ravensmere land numbered over 300 families. They farmed. They worked the mills. They paid rent, and in return, they expected a certain kind of fairness that the previous Duke had provided in an inconsistent way, and that Julian, in his first years, hadn't quite known how to offer. I understood contracts. He understood payment schedules and profit margins, and the precise point at which a business venture stopped being risky and started being inevitable. What he did not naturally understand was the 12-year-old boy whose father had just died, leaving the family's lease in question, or the widow in the eastern cottage whose roof had been leaking since October, or the 2 families in the northern fields who had been in a boundary dispute for 6 years that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with an argument that had started between their grandfathers at a harvest dinner in 1851. Adelaide understood all of it, not because she had been trained for it, but because she paid attention. She rode the estate in all weather. She sat in kitchens when people were frightened and said nothing until they were ready to talk. She learned names. She remembered them. She brought those names home to Julian not as complaints, but as information. The kind of information that, when acted upon, kept 300 families from deciding that Ravensmere's Duke was the kind of man they would work around rather than for. Julian had been grateful for this. In the early years, he had told her so in his particular way, which was not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of solid acknowledgement that she came to recognize as his version of appreciation. "You have a gift for people," he'd told her once in the 3rd year of their marriage, after she had quietly resolved a situation with a tenant family that his estate manager had been unable to untangle for months. "It isn't a gift," she'd replied. "It's attention. Anyone can do it." He'd looked at her with a small private smile. Not anyone. She had thought in that moment that he understood. She had been wrong about what he understood, and right about what he didn't. The years between their 3rd and 6th anniversary were the years Adelaide would later think of as the slow disappearance. Not of Julian exactly. He was still there, still present in the house, still occasionally sitting across from her at dinner with enough engagement to remind her of the man she had married. But something in him had begun to recede, the way a tide pulls back, and you don't notice at first, because the water is still there, still covering the rocks, still looking like the sea. It's only when you look down and find your feet on sand that wasn't there before that you realize how much has already gone. He traveled more. London, Edinburgh. Leeds, the coal mines were expanding. The wool mills were acquiring new equipment, and Julian had discovered that he had a particular talent for identifying industrial investments that his peers considered too modern or too risky. He was right about them more often than he was wrong. His wealth grew. Ravensmere's debt was not only cleared, but converted into capital, and Julian Ravenscroft became the kind of man who received letters from MPs and industrialists, and men who ran banks, the kind of letters that needed immediate replies. Adelaide ran the estate, not as a temporary arrangement, not as a courtesy, as a fact, the kind of fact that everyone around them accepted so naturally that it stopped being acknowledged and simply became the way things were. She managed the tenants. She oversaw the household. She represented Ravensmere at county events when Julian was in London, and at London dinners when Julian was in Yorkshire, and at the kind of quiet social gatherings that were actually negotiations in evening clothes. She raised their daughter Clara, who had arrived in the 5th year of their marriage with Julian's dark eyes and Adelaide's particular habit of watching before speaking. She did all of it, and Julian, when she pointed it out, would nod with the kind of distracted appreciation that a man offers when he already knows the answer to something and has moved on to the next problem before the conversation finished. "You're extraordinary," he would say in those years. "I don't know what this estate would be without you." And Adelaide would think, "Then show me." She never said it. That was perhaps her first mistake. Vivienne Laurent arrived in London in the autumn of 1883. She was 24 years old. Though Julian, when he first mentioned her to Adelaide, did not include her age in the description. He mentioned her voice. He mentioned that she had been performing at the Royal Opera House, and that the reviews had been extraordinary. He mentioned that she was French, or partly French, and that she had a quality on stage that very few performers possessed, the quality of making the audience feel that she was performing specifically for them. Adelaide had heard this and thought very little of it. Julian had always appreciated music. He attended the opera when he was in London because it was the kind of thing that a successful duke did, and because the social dimensions of those evenings were useful in ways that had nothing to do with the music itself. She did not suspect at that point that anything had already begun. She did not suspect for another 8 months. It was Clara who told her, not deliberately, not with any understanding of what she was communicating, but in the way that 6-year-olds communicate things, which is with pure, unfiltered accuracy. Papa's friend came to the house on Grosvenor Street. Clara announced at breakfast one morning in the summer of 1884, with the complete indifference of a child reporting something she has already fully processed. "The lady with the red dress." Adelaide set down her teacup very carefully. "Which friend, darling?" "The singing lady. She was there when Nanny took me to see Papa for tea." Clara reached for a piece of toast. She was very pretty. She laughed at everything Papa said. Adelaide said nothing more about it at the table. She finished breakfast. She saw Clara to her morning lessons. She went to her sitting room, closed the door, and stood at the window for a long time, looking at the Yorkshire moors without seeing them. Then she sat down and wrote a letter to Julian, not accusing, not hysterical, but direct in the way that she had always been direct with him. She asked him plainly what his relationship with Vivienne Laurent was. She asked because she deserved to know. She asked because 8 years of marriage and everything she had built for Ravensmere had earned her the right to an honest answer. Julian replied 4 days later. The reply was brief, and she recognized this even then, carefully worded in a way designed to make her feel that the question itself was the problem. He wrote, "Vivienne is a friend. I would ask you to trust that your concerns are unnecessary." Adelaide read it twice, folded it, placed it in her correspondence box, and understood with the particular clarity that comes when a woman has finally stopped explaining away what she already knows, that Julian had not answered her question at all. What followed was not a confrontation. Not immediately. Adelaide was not a woman who acted from the first wave of feeling she had learned in years of managing 300 families and their complicated interwoven needs, that the first wave of feeling was almost never the right moment to speak. She waited. She watched. She continued to do what she had always done, which was to hold Ravensmere together with the quiet, relentless competence that Julian had long since stopped noticing, and she gathered information, the way she had always gathered it, not through confrontation, but through attention. By October of 1884, she knew enough. Julian had been maintaining an arrangement with Vivienne Laurent for at least 14 months. The house on Grosvenor Street, nominally leased for Julian's London visits, was in practice a household that Vivienne participated in with a comfort that suggested permanence. Julian's trips to London had increased from twice monthly to nearly weekly. His correspondence, which Adelaide had never read uninvited, had developed a secondary thread she became aware of through the household's stationary expenditure letters, written and dispatched at hours that corresponded to nothing in his business calendar. She knew all of this when Julian came home to Ravensmere for Christmas that year, and sat across from her at the dinner table, and spoke about his plans for the northern coal expansion with the ease of a man who believed himself unobserved. She waited until Clara had been taken to bed. "I know about Vivienne," Adelaide said across the cleared table in a voice that was entirely steady. Julian's face did something complicated. It moved through several expressions in rapid succession, the particular sequence Adelaide noted of a man who had prepared for this conversation, and is now discovering that his preparation was for the wrong version of it. "Adelaide, I am not asking you to explain." She set down her wineglass. "I am telling you that I know. I want you to understand that I know, because I will not have a conversation built on a foundation of what we're both pretending." He was quiet. Then, "It is not what you think." "Tell me what it is then." How was quiet again. Longer this time. And in that silence, Adelaide learned more than she had in 8 years of conversation, because what a man will not say, when given the opportunity to correct a misunderstanding, is its own kind of answer. "She makes me feel..." He stopped, started again. "She doesn't expect anything from me." Adelaide looked at him. "I see. That is not a criticism of you. It is a description of what you prefer," Adelaide replied, "which tells me everything I need to know about how you experience our marriage." He leaned forward. "You and I have built something remarkable here. This estate, Clara, the work you've done, none of that is something I take lightly." "But you take me for granted." It wasn't a question. Julian's jaw tightened. "That is not..." "You have had a woman in our London house for over a year," Adelaide said. "You brought her there while Clara visited. You did not answer my letter honestly, and now you are sitting in our home at Christmas, across from the woman who has managed your estate, and raised your daughter, and held your name together in every room in 3 counties, and you are telling me that she doesn't expect anything from you, as if that is meant to be a point in her favor." She stood. Slowly, without anger, or rather with anger that had been controlled into something much quieter and much more formidable. "I expect things from you, Julian. I always have. I expected honesty. I expected respect. I expected that when you said I was the one person who saw you before the title, you meant it as something more than a sentence you used once and forgot." She left the dining room. She went to her sitting room and sat in the chair by the fire alone, and listened to the house around her, to the sounds of Ravensmere settling in the cold, to the distant sound of the moors, to the particular silence of a house that she had kept running for 8 years, and that did not know yet what was about to change. Julian did not end the arrangement with Vivienne. He managed through the following months to conduct himself at Ravensmere with a kind of careful normalcy that Adelaide recognized as the behavior of a man who hoped the problem would resolve itself without requiring him to act. He was present. He was courteous. He occasionally joined her for dinner without being pressed. He brought Clara a mechanical music box from London that played 12 different tunes and made their daughter shriek with delight. He did not at any point apologize. Adelaide watched all of it and said nothing. Not because she had decided to accept it, she had not, and she never would, but because she was waiting to understand what she was going to do. The Fairmont money was her mother's mostly. The estate in Hampshire was her father's. She had come to Ravensmere with a settlement that by the standards of English aristocratic marriages in 1876 was respectable but not substantial. She had no independent income beyond what Julian provided as the household allocation. She had a daughter who was 6 years old and belonged by every legal convention of 1885 to her father first and her mother second. These were facts. Adelaide was not a woman who looked away from facts. She wrote to her father. Not about the marriage, not yet not in terms that required explanation. She wrote about the Fairmont land, about a property question, about the rental income from 2 farms her grandfather had left in trust. Lord Theodore Fairmont replied in his careful, rounded handwriting with the information she needed, and a single additional sentence that told her he understood far more than she had written. "My dear girl, the Fairmont name has always been yours to use," she wrote to her mother. Lady Beatrice's lie arrived by return post, which was itself a message her mother never used. Return post for anything that didn't require immediate attention. Come home if you need to. The answer will always be yes. Adelaide folded both letters and placed them in the same box as Julian's careful, evasive reply from the year before. Then she went back to work. She visited the tenants. She resolved 3 separate disputes involving the mill expansion. She sat with the Hargreaves family while their eldest son recovered from a fever that had worried the whole northern end of the estate. She attended a dinner in Leeds as Ravensmere's representative because Julian was in London, and she spoke to 3 men about wool pricing in a way that resulted in a contract that Julian later referred to as a very fortunate arrangement. She kept everything running, and she kept her own counsel. The letter arrived in March of 1885. It was addressed to Adelaide from Julian's estate manager in London, not from Julian himself, which was the first thing she noticed. Mr. Carruth had been Julian's man of business for 11 years, and he was loyal to Julian in the particular way of men who have been well paid and treated fairly, which is to say absolutely until the moment they're not. The letter was brief. It informed her that the house on Grosvenor Street was being permanently retained, not leased retained, and that certain arrangements were being formalized. It was the kind of letter that a man writes when he believes the matter is settled and only the details remain. Adelaide read it at her writing desk. Then she set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. The matter was not settled. The details were not what remained. She put on her riding coat. She went to the stables, saddled her horse herself, the groom offered, and she declined, and she rode the full circuit of the Ravensmere estate that she had ridden in every season for 8 years. She rode past the tenant farms, past the mill, past the eastern fields where the Caldwell family had planted their first successful wheat crop after 3 years of trying, past the northern boundary where old Mr. Fenwick still kept a fence line her father-in-law had agreed to in 1862, and that no paperwork had ever formally recorded. She rode it all, and she looked at it, and she thought about what it meant, not the land, but the people, what it meant that she knew all of their names, what it meant that when a harvest failed, they came to her, not to Julian, what it meant that when a lease dispute arose, it was Adelaide's word that settled it before it ever reached a solicitor. She rode back to the house. She dismounted. She walked into Julian's study, where he was not. He was in London, and she sat in his chair behind his desk and looked at the estate ledgers he kept there. She found the coal mine contracts, the mill agreements, the records of every financial transaction Julian had made in the past 3 years. She was not looking for evidence of wrongdoing. She already knew everything she needed to know about his conduct. She was looking for something else. For the shape of a thing. For the question of what exactly Adelaide Fairmont Ravensmere had built in 8 years and what it was worth. She sat there for 2 hours. When she was done, she replaced everything exactly as she had found it. She went to her own writing desk, and she wrote 2 letters, one to her father and one to her father's solicitor. Neither letter was about revenge. Both letters were about what she planned to do next. Julian arrived at Ravensmere 4 days later. He came earlier than expected. No announcement, no letter ahead of himself. He arrived mid-afternoon on a Thursday when Adelaide was in the middle of a conversation with 2 of the northern tenant farmers about a drainage problem that had been worsening since autumn. She heard his carriage. She didn't stop the conversation. By the time Julian found her, she was in the yard behind the east wing, standing between Thomas Mallory, who farmed 60 acres of the northern fields, and had 3 sons and a temper. He kept on a very short leash, and old Margaret Fenwick, who was 81 years old, and had lived on Ravensmere land for longer than Julian had been alive. "Your Grace," Adelaide said without turning all the way around, because she was looking at the diagram Thomas had drawn in the dirt with a stick to illustrate the drainage flow. "You're back early." "We need to speak," Julian said. "We do." She straightened and looked at Thomas and Margaret. "I'll have the drainage surveyor out by Friday. Don't let anyone start digging on the west side of the field until we know where the problem begins." Thomas nodded with the kind of solid respect that a man offers someone he actually trusts. Margaret Fenwick looked at Julian with the expression of a woman who has seen dukes come and go and has formed opinions about most of them. Adelaide walked with Julian into the house. He didn't wait until they were in the study. "I know you received Mr. Carruth's letter," he said in the entrance hall with his coat still on. "I want to explain. You don't need to." She turned to face him. "I understood the letter." "Adelaide, you're keeping the house." She kept her voice level. "You're formalizing an arrangement. You think this is a conversation about my feelings, and I want you to understand that it isn't. It's a conversation about what happens next." Julian's expression shifted. It was the look of a man who had prepared for an argument and found himself unexpectedly in a negotiation. "What happens next," he said carefully, "is that our lives continue. You are my wife. Clara is our daughter. Ravensmere is—" "What I have made it," Adelaide said. Silence. She let it sit for a moment. "I want you to hear that, Julian, not as an accusation, as a statement of fact which I think you know is true. What Ravensmere is the loyalty of the tenants, the reputation in the county, the relationships that have kept this estate stable through 2 mill disputes and a failed harvest, and 3 years of coal pricing changes. I built that. While you were in London." Julian's jaw worked. "I am aware of your contribution. I'm not asking for your awareness. I'm asking for your honesty." She met his eyes. "Are you ending your arrangement with Vivienne Laurent?" Another silence. "That is not yes or no, Julian." He looked away. Toward the window, toward the door, toward anywhere that wasn't her direct gaze. And in that avoidance, she had her answer. "Then I think," Adelaide said quietly, "we both know what comes next. And I want you to understand something before we go any further. I have loved you for 8 years, and I have given this marriage every honest effort I had. I am not walking away from it in bitterness. I am walking away because you have made it clear in every way that matters that you do not value what I am to you." Julian turned back to her. And for a moment, just a moment, she saw something cross his face that was neither his boardroom authority nor his careful social composure. Something unsteady. Something that looked briefly like a man who has just heard a sound he didn't know he was afraid of. "You would leave," he said. "Everything we've built. I built it alongside you." Her voice didn't waver. "And I can build again without you." She turned and walked to the stairs. She did not run. She did not slam a door. She walked with the full measured composure of a woman who had made a decision she'd been moving toward for a long time and was no longer afraid of it. Behind her, Julian stood in the entrance hall of the estate she had kept alive, The halls she knew better than he did. The house that breathed, because she had insisted it would, and she heard as she reached the top of the stairs the sound of him not calling after her. That silence told her everything. It was the same silence as his letter all those months ago. The same silence as 8 years of effort going unacknowledged. The same silence that a man produces when he has calculated the cost of something and decided wrongly that it falls within a range he can absorb. Adelaide went to her room. She began quietly to make her plans. 3 weeks later, Julian Ravenscroft did something that Adelaide had not quite expected, despite everything she had come to understand about him. He brought Vivienne Laurent to Ravensmere. Not to London, not to a separate house. To Ravensmere Hall, the estate. Adelaide had run for 8 years, the house where their daughter slept, the home that bore Adelaide's fingerprints in every room and every relationship and every carefully maintained agreement. He brought her on a Friday in April, with no announcement beyond a brief note delivered that morning: "I will arrive this afternoon with a guest. Please ensure the East Wing guest rooms are prepared." The housekeeper. Mrs. Dorset brought Adelaide the note with an expression of careful neutrality that cost the woman a visible effort. Adelaide read it. "Please prepare the rooms," Adelaide told her. "Your Grace." "The rooms, Mrs. Dorset, as requested." She handed the note back. "And please ensure Clara's afternoon lessons run until 5 o'clock today." She went to her own room. She sat by the window. She thought about what this meant, not what it felt like, because she already knew what it felt like, and the feeling was a thing she had been managing quietly for nearly a year. She thought about what it meant in practical terms, about what Julian had decided by bringing Vivienne here that he was willing to declare. He had decided she would stay. He had decided that she had nowhere to go. No leverage, no options that outweighed what Ravensmere offered. He had decided, in the way that powerful men sometimes decide these things, that her endurance of the past year was evidence of acceptance, when in fact it had been preparation. Adelaide stood up. She walked to her writing desk and took out a letter she had written 3 days ago, and had not yet sent the one to her father's solicitor, with instructions she had been waiting to finalize. She read it through, made one small addition, sealed it. Then she rang for her maid and asked her to send a rider to the post immediately. Julian arrived at 4 o'clock. Vivienne Laurent was exactly as Adelaide might have predicted: young, beautiful in the particular way of women who understand how to be looked at, and wearing an expression of carefully maintained ease that must have cost her some effort in the carriage ride from the station. Adelaide met them in the entrance hall. She was in her afternoon dress, dark blue wool, composed, perfectly arranged. She looked exactly like what she was, the Duchess of Ravensmere, in her own house on ground she knew better than anyone in it. "Adelaide," Julian said. There was something in his voice. She recognized the tone of a man testing whether the ground will hold his weight. "Your Grace." She looked at Vivienne. "You must be Miss Laurent. I've heard you have an extraordinary voice." Vivienne's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She had expected Adelaide suspected something different. Tears, perhaps, or cold fury. Something that would position her as the victim of a difficult wife. Instead, she got courtesy. The particular impenetrable courtesy of an English duchess who has decided something and is no longer afraid of anything. "Thank you," Vivienne managed. "Your home is... Mrs. Dorset will show you to the East Wing." Adelaide turned to the housekeeper, who was standing in the corridor with an expression Adelaide recognized as a woman containing multitudes. "Please see that Miss Laurent has everything she needs." She turned back to Julian. "When you're settled," Adelaide said, "I'd appreciate a word in the study." She walked away before he could answer. In the study, she stood at the window and waited. Outside, the Ravensmere moors stretched out in the late afternoon light. Somewhere on those moors, Thomas Mallory was finishing his day's work on 60 acres of land he'd farmed for 20 years. Margaret Fenwick was in her cottage where she'd lived since before Adelaide was born. 300 families were going about the ordinary business of their lives on land that bore the Ravenscroft name. They did not know yet what was coming, but Adelaide did. When Julian came in and closed the study door behind him, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. something between defiance and unease. The look of a man who has just played a card and is not certain it was the right one. "I need you to understand," he said, "that this is the life I want now." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the man who had taken her hands before a chapel full of guests and said she was the one person who saw him before the title. She thought about that sentence, about how much of herself she had built around it, and how long she had waited for it to be true again. "I understand exactly what you want," she said at last. "And I need you to understand what I want." She crossed the room and placed an envelope on his desk. "That is a letter from my solicitor. It outlines my intention to separate from this household and the terms I am requesting." Julian stared at the envelope. He did not pick it up. "You are making a decision," he said slowly, "that you will not be able to reverse." "I am." She met his eyes. "And I want you to know I am not making it in anger. I am making it because I endured your absence for years because I loved you. I will not endure your disrespect because I love myself." Julian's face did something complicated again. She watched it this time without the old hope, without the part of her that used to wait for him to come back to himself. "You'll have nothing without this estate," he said. It came out quiet, and she almost believed he didn't mean it as a threat. Almost. "I will have the Fairmont name," Adelaide replied. "And everything I built before I came here, and everything I've learned since. You may find, Julian, that it turns out to be more than you thought." She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the doorframe and turned back once. "I genuinely wish you well," she said. "I mean that. I hope you find what you're looking for." Then she walked out, and Julian Ravenscroft stood alone in his study, with an envelope on his desk and the sound of his wife's footsteps going quietly away through the house she had kept alive for 8 years, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence that surrounded him did not feel like peace. It felt like the beginning of a cost he hadn't yet calculated. The envelope sat on Julian's desk for 3 days before he opened it. Adelaide knew this because Mrs. Dorset told her, not directly, not with any disloyalty to the Duke, but in the careful, sideways manner of a woman who has served a household long enough to understand that the Duchess needed to know things without being told she needed to know them. Mrs. Dorset had been at Ravensmere for 19 years. She had watched Adelaide arrive as a young bride and learn the name of every tenant on 300 acres within her first winter. She had her own opinions about what was happening, and she expressed them through silence, through small, careful acts, and through the precise amount of information she chose to share. "The study has not been opened since Friday morning, Your Grace." That was all she said, but it was enough. Adelaide had expected Julian to come to her immediately. She had braced herself for it, for the argument, for the manipulation, for the version of Julian that emerged when he felt cornered. Instead, she got 3 days of careful distance, of meals taken separately, of Julian occupying the west wing of the house with Vivienne Laurent, as if the situation were a matter of logistics rather than a catastrophe of his own making. On the 4th morning, he knocked on her sitting room door. She was at her writing desk when he came in. She had been corresponding with 2 of the tenant farmers about the drainage survey, which had confirmed what Thomas Mallory had suspected, that the problem was a blocked culvert dating back to 1871 that nobody had touched because nobody had been paying attention. She did not set the correspondence aside when Julian entered. She finished the sentence she was writing and then looked up. He had not slept well. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way he carried himself, still controlled, always controlled, but with the particular tightness of a man who has been arguing with himself for several nights in a row and hasn't reached a conclusion. "I've read the letter," he said. "I assumed you had." He moved to the chair across from her desk, the one that guests usually sat in, which was not lost on either of them, and he sat down. He laced his hands together and looked at her with the expression she had once found compelling, the expression of a man working through a difficult problem with his full intelligence. "What you're asking for is reasonable," Adelaide said. "My solicitor assures me it's reasonable. You're asking to remove yourself from Ravensmere entirely. I'm asking for a formal separation, a settlement from the Fairmont Trust, which is mine by legal right, and access to Clara on terms we agree upon together." She set down her pen. "Those are not extraordinary demands." Julian stood abruptly. He walked to the window, to the same window she had stood at 4 days ago, looking at the moors, and he kept his back to her. "If you leave," he said, "people will talk." "People are already talking, Julian. The question is what they're saying." He turned. "You think this reflects well on you? A wife who abandons her husband?" "I think," Adelaide said carefully, "that the story of what has happened here is not one you want examined too closely. A duchess who leaves is a subject of gossip. A duke who brings his mistress to his marital home is a subject of something considerably more damaging." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Julian knew she was right. She could see him knowing it, the small recalibration behind his eyes, the shift from offense to calculation. "I am not your enemy," she said more quietly. "I am telling you that I am leaving, and that I would prefer we do this with as much dignity as we can manage. For Clara's sake, for the estate's sake, and if you can hear this, for your sake as well." He stared at her. And for a moment, she thought he was going to say something real, something that was not calculation or defense. His mouth opened. "I'll speak to my solicitor," he said. Adelaide nodded. She picked up her pen. He left. She held herself very still until she heard his footsteps disappear down the corridor, and then she set the pen down again and pressed her hands flat on the desk and breathed. What Julian had not anticipated, what Adelaide had understood, and he had not, was the speed at which information moved through Ravensmere's 300 tenant families. It did not move through gossip exactly. It moved the way news moves through a community that has learned to read signs, through a steward's careful silence, through a housekeeper's expression at the market, through the fact that the Duchess had been seen riding the estate boundaries alone on 3 consecutive mornings, and that the woman staying in the East Wing guest rooms had been observed at the upstairs window at an hour when no invited guest would normally be awake. By the end of the first week, Thomas Mallory knew. By the middle of the second week, old Margaret Fenwick knew. And by the time April turned toward May, every family on Ravensmere land had formed a position on the situation, and those positions were not complicated. They were loyal to the Duchess. This was not something that had been decided in a meeting or communicated through any formal channel. It simply was the way that genuine loyalty always simply is, the way it accumulates, without announcement, over years of being seen and heard and treated as something more than a number in a ledger. Adelaide had given these people 8 years of her attention, and that attention had created something Julian had built no economic model to account for. Thomas Mallory came to find Adelaide on a Tuesday morning when she was in the small office adjacent to the estate room, working through the monthly accounts that Julian's estate manager had forwarded without comment. Thomas came in with his hat in his hands and his expression arranged with the careful dignity of a man who has something to say and intends to say it properly. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace." "Thomas." She gestured to the chair. "Sit down." He sat. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "There's been talk among the families," he said, "about what's happening, about whether you're leaving." "There has." She kept her voice steady. "I won't confirm or deny what you may have heard, but I will tell you honestly that my situation here is changing." Thomas nodded slowly. He looked at his hat. Then he looked back at her. "If you go," he said, "we'll not be paying our rents to a man who did what he did to you." Adelaide went very still. "Thomas, it's not just me saying it. It's Hargreaves. It's the Caldwells. It's every family on the North End and most of the South." He met her eyes with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who has thought about this carefully and has nothing to take back. "Mrs. Fenwick says she's not paid rent to a Ravenscroft she didn't trust since 1849, and she's not about to start now." The weight of it settled over Adelaide slowly, like something enormous moving at a quiet pace. She had not asked for this. She had not expected it. And she found, sitting in that small office with Thomas Mallory and his hat and his quiet absolute certainty, that she was not as composed as she had believed herself to be. "I appreciate that," she managed. "More than I can say. It's not sentiment." He shook his head. "There's a drought coming this summer, we know it. The drainage problem. The Northfield yields were down last year. We need someone who'll look at those numbers and see people, not losses." He paused. "The Duke sees losses." "He sees opportunity," Adelaide said carefully. He sees it differently than I do. He sees it without you. Thomas stood. That's the difference. After he left, Adelaide sat alone for a long time. She had spent a year preparing herself for what leaving Ravensmere would cost her. She had not prepared herself for the possibility that staying might cost Julian more. Julian found out about the tenants on a Thursday morning from his estate manager, Mr. Haverford, who delivered the information with the compressed expression of a man conveying news he would very much prefer not to be conveying. 14 families have indicated they will withhold the quarter-day rent, Haverford said, standing in the study doorway with a ledger Adelaide recognized as the one she herself had updated in February. Across the north and east sections, Mallory is leading it, but Hargreaves and Fenwick they've spoken to others. Julian looked up from his desk with an expression that moved through disbelief, anger, and something colder in rapid succession. On what grounds? They haven't stated grounds, Your Grace. Haverford's voice was neutral in the way of men who are paid to be neutral in uncomfortable situations. They have simply indicated they won't be paying, not until the situation at the hall is resolved to their satisfaction. The situation at the hall. Julian's voice was flat. What situation specifically have they communicated? Haverford looked at the wall just past Julian's left shoulder. The situation regarding Her Grace, sir. The silence in the study was the kind that made the walls feel closer. They are tenants, Julian said at last. They have contracts. If they withhold rent, they are in breach. They know that, Your Grace. Haverford cleared his throat. Mallory has indicated, and I am only reporting what was said, sir, that they are aware of the legal position and have consulted someone about it. Julian went very still. They've consulted a solicitor. Someone. Yes. The pen Julian was holding made a small sharp sound as it met the desk. Get out, he said. Haverford left with the quiet efficiency of a man who is relieved to be leaving. Julian came to Adelaide's sitting room that evening without knocking. She was reading or had been reading before she heard his footsteps in the corridor and recognized their pace. She set the book down and folded her hands in her lap and waited. He came in like a storm that had been building for 3 days and had finally decided on a direction. You told them. His voice was controlled fury, the particular kind that Julian Ravenscroft employed when he was angry enough to break something but too disciplined to allow himself to do it. You organized them against me. I did not. 14 families, Adelaide. 14 families made a decision. She met his gaze without flinching. I had no part in it. You expect me to believe? I expect you to believe the truth, which is that I did not ask those families to do anything. She kept her voice even. They came to me. Thomas Mallory sat in my office and told me what they intended, and I told him to think carefully about the legal implications. That is the whole of my involvement. Julian stared at her. She could see him looking for the lie in it and not finding it because there was none. His jaw tightened. Then why? He demanded. Why would they? Because they trust me, Adelaide said simply. And they don't trust what you're becoming. The words landed. She saw them land. I have managed this estate. You have managed the finances of this estate, she said. That is not the same thing. She uncrossed her hands and leaned forward slightly. Julian, listen to me. When the Hargreaves boy was sick last winter, who sat with that family for 3 days? When the Caldwells lost their barn to the fire in '83, who organized the rebuilding effort before the insurance claim had even been filed? When old Fenwick's boundary dispute went to the magistrate in '81, who wrote the letter that kept it from becoming a legal catastrophe for everyone involved? He said nothing. I did, she said. Not because it was my job, because they were people, and people who are treated like people become loyal. Not because they're paid, because they're respected. She stood. You cannot replace that with a contract, Julian. You cannot compel it. You cannot buy it back once it's gone. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the unsteadiness he was working to contain. What do you want? His voice had dropped. Tell me what you want. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had wanted once. She thought about the man in the chapel with her hands in his, saying she was the one person who saw him before the title. "I want to leave with my dignity," she said. "And I want Clara twice monthly with no argument from your solicitor. And I want you to understand, really understand what this estate will look like without the 8 years I've put into it." Julian's face did something she hadn't seen it do in a long time. It cracked just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath, which was not the Duke and not the businessman, but something older and less armored. "I don't want you to go," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 2 years. She looked at him. She felt the old pull of it, the way that love doesn't disappear just because it's been mishandled. The way that 8 years leaves marks that don't lift the moment you decide to move. "I know," she said quietly. "But wanting me to stay is not the same as treating me as if I'm worth staying for." She moved around him. She walked to the door. "Speak to your solicitor, Julian, and ask him to be reasonable. That's all I'm asking." She left him standing in her sitting room, in the room she had arranged and used and made into a quiet refuge over 8 years, and she walked down the corridor and didn't look back. The days that followed had a particular texture that Adelaide would remember later. A kind of compressed clarity, as if everything unnecessary had been burned away, and what remained was only what was real. She packed carefully. She was not leaving immediately, the legalities required time, and she had Clara to think about, and there were things at Ravensmere that needed to be handed over properly, because Adelaide Fairmont was not a woman who left a mess behind her. She documented everything. Every tenant agreement, every outstanding dispute, every informal understanding that existed only in her knowledge and had never been written down. She wrote it all out in her careful, clear hand and placed it in the estate files where Julian's people could find it. She was not doing it for Julian. She was doing it for the 300 families who had not chosen to be caught in the middle of this. Clara knew something was happening. Children always do. They read the texture of a household the way animals read weather through instinct and accumulated observation. She was 6 years old and very serious about things she cared about, and she came to Adelaide's room one evening and stood in the doorway with her mechanical music box under one arm, and her expression arranged with the solemn concentration of someone working through a problem. "Are you going away?" Clara asked. Adelaide sat down on the edge of the bed and held out her arms. Clara came to her immediately despite everything. Despite the uncertainty in the household, she came without hesitation. "I'm going to Grandmama and Grandpapa's house in Hampshire for a while," Adelaide said. "I'll come back to see you, very often." "How often?" "Twice a month. More if I can manage it." Clara considered this with the same focused seriousness she brought to everything. "Will you come for my birthday?" "I will come for every birthday you ever have." Adelaide pressed her lips to her daughter's hair. "That is a promise I will keep until I am old and you are older." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Papa is sad." Adelaide held her more tightly. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that make everyone sad for a while," she said. "Even when those decisions are the right ones." Is it the right one? No 6-year-old should have to carry that question. No mother should have to answer it to her child. "Yes," Adelaide said. "It is." Clara wound the key on her music box. 12 notes played a small bright sound in the quiet room. "I'll play it so you can hear it when you're far away," Clara said. Adelaide held her daughter and said nothing at all. The rent situation worsened faster than Julian had anticipated. By the second week of May, the number of withholding families had risen from 14 to 31, then by the following Friday to 47. The movement had spread from the north and east sections to the western farms, which were the largest producers on the estate, and whose quarterly payments represented a substantial portion of Ravensmere's operating income. Julian's estate manager sent daily reports. Julian's solicitor sent a letter advising caution in the language of legal action. Julian himself paced the study in the evenings, in a way that Mrs. Dorset reported to Adelaide without being asked, because Mrs. Dorset had her own sense of justice and her own ways of enacting it. What Julian could not understand what he had. Haverford investigate and could not find an answer for was the coordination. There was none. That was the truth of it, and it was the thing he found most unsettling. These families had not organized. They had not elected a representative. They had not sent a petition or drafted terms. They had simply, each in their own household, on their own reasoning, arrived at the same decision. Which meant the loyalty Adelaide had built over 8 years was not a network that could be dismantled or redirected. It was a conviction held by individuals that ran deeper than contract. Mr. Haverford finally told him this directly, because he was an honest man who had reached the limit of diplomatic framing. "Your Grace," he said, standing in the study on a gray Thursday morning. "I have spoken to the families, individually. I have explained the legal position. I have made clear that the consequences of breach will be pursued." He paused. "They already know, and they are not moving." Julian looked at him. "What do they want?" His voice was quieter than she had heard it in weeks. "That's the thing, sir." Haverford turned his hat slowly. "They haven't asked for anything. They've said, and I'm relaying this directly, they said they're not paying rent to a man who treated her the way you treated her Grace." The room was very still. One of them. Haverford continued carefully. "A Mrs. Caldwell from the western section. She said something I think you need to hear." He cleared his throat. "She said, 'Your Grace obeys the title,' but we followed her heart." Julian sat back. He looked at the ledger in front of him. The numbers in it were real, the kind of numbers that meant something, that represented coal and wool and wheat, and the accumulated machinery of an estate that he had rebuilt from debt into a considerable fortune. The numbers were clear. They were correct. And they were in that moment entirely insufficient. He had built an empire, Julian Ravenscroft. He had turned ruins into fortune, and made men who had inherited more than him look at him with quiet envy. He had done it through intelligence and discipline, and a willingness to act when others hesitated. He understood leverage and capital, and the precise architecture of a profitable enterprise. What he did not understand, what the numbers in his ledger could not tell him, and what no solicitor's letter could resolve, was how a woman who had never demanded recognition had nevertheless become the load-bearing wall of everything he'd built. He sat alone in the study for a long time after Haverford left. The envelope with Adelaide's solicitor's terms was still on the desk. He had been negotiating around it for 2 weeks, offering revisions, requesting modifications, doing what he did with every difficult negotiation, which was to work the edges until the center gave way. The center was not giving way. He picked up the envelope. He read through it again, the formal, careful language of Adelaide's solicitor, the terms that were, as Adelaide had said, reasonable. The separation, the Fairmont settlement, the Clara arrangements, all of it reasonable, all of it measured, all of it carrying in its very reasonableness the quiet devastation of a woman who had stopped expecting him to be what she'd needed and was simply methodically reclaiming her life. He put the envelope down. He picked up his pen. He sat there for a long time with the pen in his hand and the ledger in front of him and the sound of the house around him. The house Adelaide had run, the house that breathed her careful management in every corner, and he tried to calculate what he had actually lost. He tried to put it in numbers. He couldn't. Adelaide's final week at Ravensmere had a strange quality of calm, the particular calm that follows a decision too large to be undone, when there is nothing left to agonize over because the path is already chosen. She moved through the house with the unhurried certainty of a woman finishing a job she had always intended to do well, and doing it well to the end regardless of the circumstances. She said goodbye to Mrs. Dorset on a Wednesday morning in the kitchen corridor where no one else could see. Mrs. Dorset held herself with great dignity, and then when Adelaide embraced her, held on for a moment longer than either of them expected. 19 years, Mrs. Dorset said quietly. I know which years were worth serving. Adelaide pulled back. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. Take care of Clara, she managed. Every day. She said goodbye to Thomas Mallory on Thursday in the yard. He shook her hand, a gesture between equals that an English duchess and a tenant farmer would not ordinarily have shared, and that meant more than anything ceremonial could have. The rents, Adelaide said to him. Don't hold out forever on my account. This estate needs to function. We'll decide that when we see what kind of man he chooses to be, Thomas replied. That's always been the test, hasn't it? On Friday morning, she came down the stairs with her trunk already loaded, Clara's voice still coming from the upper floor, where her governess was managing breakfast, with deliberate loudness, to give everyone a kind of privacy. Julian was in the entrance hall. She had not expected him to be there. She had thought in a way that she recognized as naive, even as she'd thought it, that he would make it easier on both of them by not being present. I was standing in the entrance hall in the morning light, and he looked not like the Duke of Ravensmere. Not like the man who had brought his mistress to this house, and stood in the study and declared that this was the life he wanted. He looked like a man who had spent a week learning something he had not wanted to learn, and who had not yet figured out what to do with the knowledge. "I have instructed my solicitor to accept your terms," he said. "Thank you." She pulled on her gloves. "I'll have mine confirm receipt." Silence. But he didn't move from where he was standing. "They're still not paying," he said at last. 54 families now." She looked at him. "I know. I spoke to Mallory yesterday." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard in a long time, something tentative, almost questioning. "He told me they'd followed your heart." "They told me what they intended to do," she said. "I had no part in it." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" She picked up her traveling case. "Adelaide." His voice stopped her not by authority, but by something rawer than that. "When I said at the chapel when we married that you were the one person who saw me before the title, I meant that." She turned and looked at him fully. She gave him the full weight of her attention one last time. "I know you did," she said. "I believed you. I built 8 years on believing you. Then you forgot it." Her voice was gentle and absolutely unyielding. "You forgot that the man I saw before the title was capable of that kind of honesty, and you chose the version of yourself that didn't need to be honest. And I cannot go back and unknow what these 2 years have taught me." His face. She would remember his face in that moment, the particular openness of it, the way that wealth and title and all the armor he'd built over a lifetime couldn't hold its shape under the weight of genuine loss. "What happens now?" he asked. "You run your estate," she said. "You speak honestly with your tenants. You be the kind of man whose word means something." She paused. "Or you don't. But that's your work to do, not mine." She walked to the door. Outside the carriage was waiting. The Yorkshire moors stretched in the morning light. Somewhere on 300 acres, 54 families were going about their morning farming, living the particular life of people who had decided that their loyalty was not a commodity that could be transferred by legal document. Adelaide Fairmont Ravensmere stepped out of the house that had been her home for 8 years, into the air that smelled of everything she was leaving, and she did not look back. But she stood for just a moment by the carriage door and let it settle over her, the weight of it, and then the lifting of the weight, and then the particular breathable lightness of a woman who knows exactly who she is and exactly where she is going. She got into the carriage. She did not cry until they were past the estate gates, past the boundary, past the last field she had ridden in all weather for 8 long faithful years. And even then she cried quietly with great dignity, and only for a little while. Because Adelaide Fairmont had places to be. Hampshire received Adelaide the way it always had, with the particular quiet of a place that has known you long enough to ask nothing of you, to simply open and let you in. Her parents' house was not Ravensmere. It was smaller, older in the way of things that have been loved rather than managed, and it smelled of her mother's roses and her father's pipe tobacco, and the wood polish that the housekeeper had used on every surface for 30 years. Adelaide walked through the front door on a Thursday afternoon in late May, with her trunk and her traveling case, and the careful composure she had maintained for the entire journey from Yorkshire, and her mother took one look at her and said nothing at all. Just opened her arms, and Adelaide walked into them, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely identify, she let herself be held. Lady Beatrice Fairmont was 66 years old, and had navigated 30 years of English aristocratic society with a combination of intelligence and social precision that her daughter had inherited without fully realizing it. She had watched Adelaide's marriage from a careful distance, had given advice when asked, and held herself back when not, and had written that letter, Come home if you need to. The answer will always be yes, with the full understanding of a mother who could read between the lines of every letter her daughter had ever sent. She held Adelaide for a long moment. Then she stepped back and looked at her face. "You're thinner," Beatrice said. "I'm fine." "You're thinner, and you haven't slept properly in weeks." Her mother's voice was matter-of-fact, rather than pitying, which was exactly what Adelaide needed. "Come inside. I have things to tell you, and you need tea and something to eat before I tell you any of them." Lord Theodore Fairmont appeared in the corridor, a tall, slightly stooped man of 72, who had spent 40 years in Parliament, and had developed over those decades the particular quality of a man who knows how much he doesn't know. He looked at his daughter, and then he did something Adelaide had not seen her father do in years. He crossed the corridor and put his arms around her without a word, and patted her shoulder twice, and then released her and cleared his throat and became again the composed, measured man she had always known. "Good," he said. It was all he said, but it covered everything. She slept for 11 hours on her first night at Fairmont House, which told her more about how exhausted she had been than any amount of self-examination could have. She woke to the sound of the garden birds, the groundskeeper's tools, the ordinary music of a household at morning work, and lay still for a long time before she moved. She had Clara twice monthly. She had the Fairmont settlement, which her father's solicitor had confirmed was secure and substantial enough that she did not need to be afraid of the practical future. She had this house and these people, and the quiet around her that smelled like her childhood, and felt like something she had forgotten she was allowed to want. She also had, arriving on her second morning in Hampshire, a letter from Thomas Mallory. She recognized his handwriting, a careful, slightly labored script that a man teaches himself in middle age because he understands that written words carry weight. She opened it over breakfast with her mother across the table, pretending to read the newspaper and not pretending very well. Thomas wrote 3 paragraphs. The first described the drainage situation, which had worsened, and the fact that the surveyor's report had been submitted to the estate office and ignored. The second described the rent situation, 67 families now, more than 2/3 of the estate, not paying, not planning to, not moving from that position, despite 2 letters from Julian's solicitor threatening legal action. The third paragraph was the shortest. "We want you to know, Your Grace, that this is not finished. And neither, if you have the will for it, are you." Adelaide set the letter down. Her mother lowered the newspaper. "What does it say?" Adelaide handed it to her. Beatrice read it. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened the way it always did when Lady Beatrice Fairmont smelled an opportunity. 67 families, her mother said. "Yes. That's nearly the whole estate." "Yes." Beatrice set the paper down carefully. "Adelaide, what do you intend to do about it?" Adelaide picked up her tea. "I intend to let Julian solve his own problems." "That is a reasonable position." Her mother folded the letter and slid it back across the table. "It is also not what I asked." Adelaide looked at her mother. Lady Beatrice had the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a specific conversation for a long time, and recognizes that it has finally arrived. "Tell me what you're thinking," Adelaide said. Her mother's answer surprised her. Not because it was unexpected, because it was exactly what Adelaide herself had been thinking at 3 in the morning, in the careful dark of her childhood room, when she'd been too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. "I'm thinking," Beatrice said slowly, "that 67 families who trust you are not a problem. They are a foundation." The letter from Julian arrived 10 days after Adelaide reached Hampshire. It was longer than his previous correspondence, 3 full pages in his distinct angular handwriting. The kind of letter a man writes when he has been composing it in his head for days and is finally committing it to paper before his better judgment overrules him. Adelaide read it at her father's writing desk in the study alone. He wrote about the tenants first. He described the situation with a precision she recognized: the numbers, the legal implications, the practical consequence of 67 families in breach. He had pursued the legal route and found it unworkable. A duke who sued his tenants en masse in the middle of an agricultural downturn was a duke who made enemies in Parliament, and Julian was too intelligent to miss that calculation. The law was on his side. Public sentiment was not, and in England in 1885, public sentiment could do things to a man's reputation that no court victory could repair. Then, in the second page, his tone shifted. He wrote, "I have spoken with Haverford and with Mallory directly. I understand now what I did not understand before, which is that what you gave this estate was not something I can replicate or purchase or organize into existence. I know what loyalty can be compelled to look like. What you built was not that. Then I am not writing to ask you to return. I understand that you will not, and I will not insult what you have decided by pretending otherwise. I am writing because you deserve to know that I understand what I lost, not in legal terms, not in estate management terms, but in terms of what matters between people who have shared a life." And then in the third page, a sentence she read 3 times. "Clara asked me yesterday if you were happy in Hampshire. I told her I believed you were. She said, 'Good. Mama deserves to be happy.' She is 6 years old, and she is entirely right, and I have no one to blame for the fact that I needed a 6-year-old to clarify this for me." Adelaide sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about what it would have meant to receive this letter 2 years ago, 1 year ago, even 6 months ago. She thought about how differently she would have held it with hope, rather than this particular tenderness, that had no desire attached to it, that wished him well from a place that was no longer inside his orbit. She wrote back. 2 paragraphs because 2 paragraphs was what was honest. She thanked him for his understanding. She told him Clara was right, and that she was happy or becoming happy, which was its own kind of news. She told him that the Fairmont resources and her own experience gave her options she was beginning to explore, and that she hoped in time they could conduct their arrangements regarding Clara with the kind of goodwill that their daughter deserved. She did not tell him about the thing that was beginning to take shape in her mind, the thing her mother had named over breakfast, the thing Thomas Mallory's letter had made concrete. She was not ready to speak about it yet because she was still thinking it through, turning it over, testing it against every practical obstacle she could identify. She sealed the letter. She sent it. Then she went to find her mother. The idea had a name by the end of June, though it had taken most of a month to get there. Lady Beatrice had connections that Adelaide had grown up taking for granted, and only now, at 34, was beginning to understand in their full scope. Her mother knew women, specifically women who had money of their own, or access to it, or husbands who trusted their judgment about where capital should go. Women who had watched their own estates struggle through the same agricultural pressures that had been building across England for a decade. Women who understood from lived experience what competent management of land and people actually looked like. Adelaide's idea was not complicated. It was in fact almost embarrassingly simple once it was said aloud, which was usually the sign that something was right. "I want to establish an estate management consultancy," she told her mother on a Tuesday afternoon, "for landowners who are struggling, particularly in the north. I know those communities. I know what they need and what they're willing to offer. I know how to talk to tenant families, and I know how to talk to bankers, and most importantly, I know the difference between what looks like a problem and what actually is one." Beatrice looked at her daughter over the rim of her teacup. "A consultancy," she repeated. "A formal arrangement, with fees, documented, legal, respectable." Adelaide's voice was steady and quick, the voice she used when she'd been thinking about something long enough that she was no longer working out whether it was possible, only how to make it real. "I would need your connections. I would need Father's name behind it, at least initially, until I've established a record. You have your own name. I have the Ravensmere name, which is complicated. I have the Fairmont name, which is not." Beatrice set down her cup. "Your father will agree. Don't worry about him." "I need more than agreement. I need him to make introductions. 3, perhaps 4 that will lead to others. He has more than 3 introductions in him." Her mother looked at her with something that Adelaide recognized as deep private pride, the kind a woman shows her daughter when the daughter becomes unambiguously herself. "When do you want to begin?" Adelaide thought about Thomas Mallory's letter. She thought about 67 families who had made a decision based on 8 years of being treated like people. She thought about the Hargreaves family, and the Caldwells, and old Margaret Fenwick. And she thought about the particular kind of influence that doesn't announce itself and doesn't require permission. Yesterday, Adelaide said. But the week after next will do. The first meeting happened in London in late July, in the drawing room of a woman named Mrs. Constance Aldridge, widow of Sir Edmund Aldridge, who had left her in possession of 3,000 acres in Lincolnshire, and the formidable task of understanding what to do with them. Constance Aldridge was 58 years old, sensible in the way of women who have survived being underestimated, and she had heard about Adelaide through a chain of introductions that went Lord Theodore Fairmont to his former parliamentary colleague, Sir William Drey, to Sir William's wife, to Lady Beatrice's old friend Mrs. Hatton, to Constance herself. She greeted Adelaide in her drawing room with the wariness of a woman accustomed to being sold solutions that don't account for the actual problem. "Lady Beatrice's daughter," she said. "Adelaide Fairmont." Adelaide offered her hand. "I understand you have a situation in Lincolnshire. I have several situations in Lincolnshire." Constance gestured to the chair across from her. "My late husband's estate manager is managing, which means he's managing to conceal how much he doesn't know. 3 tenant farms have been vacant for 18 months because we can't agree on the terms. And the drainage on the eastern section is don't tell me you know about drainage." "I know that drainage problems are usually about something other than drainage," Adelaide said. "Tell me about the east section." They talked for 2 hours. Adelaide asked questions and listened in the way she had always listened, completely, without the agenda of reaching a particular conclusion. And by the end of the 2 hours, Constance Aldridge was sitting forward in her chair, with the expression of a woman who has found something she needed without knowing she was looking for it. "You actually understand this," Constance said. "I managed a comparable estate for 8 years, Ravensmere." Constance's voice was careful. "I heard there was a situation." "There was." Adelaide met her eyes directly. "I left. The situation was not about competence." A pause. "The estate is currently experiencing some difficulty with tenant relations, which I think speaks for itself." Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she did something Adelaide hadn't expected. She laughed, a genuine sharp sound that filled the drawing room. "What you're describing," Constance said, "is exactly what happened to my husband's estate in the 3 years before he died, when he started spending more time in London than in Lincolnshire. The tenants started finding reasons not to communicate. Problems went unreported until they became disasters." She shook her head. "I fixed it by doing what he didn't, which was showing up and listening. But I don't have enough hours or enough knowledge of agricultural contracting to do it all myself." "That's precisely what I'm offering," Adelaide said. "When can you come to Lincolnshire?" Adelaide had not expected the question quite so quickly, but she did not hesitate. "August," she said. "Give me August." She went to Yorkshire first because there was something she needed to do. She had not told Julian she was coming. She had written to Thomas Mallory because the practical reality was that Thomas needed to know he was the one coordinating the tenant position, and Adelaide needed to speak with him directly before anything else could be decided. But she had not written to Julian, and when she arrived at Ravensmere in late July, it was not to the hall. She met Thomas Mallory at his farm kitchen. The same kitchen she had sat in over the years when there were problems to solve, the same table with the same worn surface, and the same chairs that had hosted more consequential conversations than their appearance suggested. Thomas had aged slightly in the weeks since she'd left, not with time, with weight. The weight of a position he'd taken on behalf of 67 families and was now responsible for holding. "You didn't have to come," he said when she sat down. "I know." She set her gloves on the table. "How are you managing it?" "The legal letters have stopped," Thomas said. "His solicitor sent 3. We didn't reply to any of them. Then they stopped." He paused. "Haverford told one of the men that the Duke had instructed him to hold, whatever that means." "It means Julian is thinking," Adelaide said. "He's recalculating." Thomas studied her face. "And you, what are you doing?" "I'm building something." She told him about Constance Aldridge, about the consultancy, about her mother's connections and her father's introductions. She watched Thomas's face while she talked the gradual shift from careful neutrality to something more open. "That's not nothing," he said when she finished. "No, it's not." "Is it enough?" She looked at him. "Enough for what, Thomas?" Howe was quiet for a moment. Then, enough for you. Enough that in 5 years you look back on this and know you didn't just survive it, you built something from it. The words landed differently than she'd expected. She sat with them for a moment before she answered. I think it might be, she said. That's why I'm here. I want you to understand the tenants' position. Whatever they decide, that is their decision. I'm not organizing it. I won't be using it. What they do and what I do are separate things. We know that. Thomas nodded. We've always known that. That's rather the point. She looked at him. What do you want, Thomas, from the situation with Julian? What does a resolution look like to you? I was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the kitchen sounds filled the space, a bird outside, the distant sound of his eldest son, working somewhere on the property. We want to know, Thomas said finally, that the man we pay our money to, that he understands what it cost. He paused. Not the money, what it actually cost. The thing that can't be replaced. Adelaide understood. She understood completely. I'll speak to him, she said. Thomas looked up sharply. Your Grace. Not for the estate, not for the rents. She stood pulling on her gloves. Because someone should, and I am the only person in this situation who can say what needs to be said without it being about something else. She went to the hall. Julian was in the study when she arrived. She had not sent word ahead, and he looked up from his desk with an expression of unguarded shock that told her he had not expected this, had not calculated for this particular variable. He stood immediately. It was the first time she had seen him stand for her in a long time. Adelaide. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard there in years. Something without armor. Sit down, Julian. She took the chair across the desk. The guest chair, the same chair Thomas had sat in when he told her about the tenants. I'm not here to renegotiate. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to tell you something you need to hear, and then I'm going to leave, and we can proceed as the legal documents require. He sat. He folded his hands on the desk and said nothing, which she appreciated. 67 families, she said. Do you know why that number keeps growing? Because they're loyal to you. Because they trusted this estate, she corrected. They trusted that Ravensmere was the kind of place where people were treated with respect. I was the evidence of that. When I left, when the circumstances of my leaving became clear, I stopped being evidence and started being proof of the opposite. She let that sit for a moment. They're not punishing you for what you did to me. They're responding to what you revealed about what this estate is willing to do to people. Julian's face was still. Too still, the stillness of a man working very hard not to let anything show. What do I do? He asked. You go to them, Adelaide said simply. Not Haverford, not your solicitor, you. You go to Thomas Mallory, and you sit at his kitchen table, and you listen to him talk about the drainage problem on the North Field, and you don't talk about the lease or the rent or the legal position. You listen, and then you act on what you hear, and then you do it again and again until they believe you. She paused. That's all. There's no shortcut. There's no contract that replaces it. Julian looked at her for a long moment. Will they accept that after everything? I don't know, she said honestly. But I know there's no other way. He was quiet. Then, you came here to tell me this. I came here because 67 families are in a difficult position, and their difficulty is going to get worse before it gets better if someone doesn't start moving in the right direction. She stood. This is me pointing you toward the right direction. What you do with it is your work. She turned to leave. Adelaide. His voice stopped her at the door. She turned back. He looked at her, not with calculation, not with the careful authority of a duke managing a difficult situation, with the stripped-down honesty of a man who has finally run out of ways to avoid himself. I'm sorry, he said. Not as a negotiating position, not because of the tenants or the estate or the legal situation, because I took something that was given freely and treated it as if it would never run out. She held his gaze. I know, she said quietly. I believe you mean that. Is it enough? She thought about Thomas Mallory's question. Enough that you look back and know you built something from it. It's a beginning, she said. Whether it's enough depends on what you do next. She walked out through the entrance hall past the place on the stairs where she had stood 8 weeks ago and made a decision she had known for months was coming. Past the corridor where Mrs. Dorset had told her things in careful sideways sentences. Past the doorway of the dining room where she and Julian had eaten 8 years of dinners, some of them good. She walked out into the Yorkshire afternoon and got into her carriage, and she did not feel the lifting she'd felt when she'd left the first time. That had been relief and fear, and the enormous exhale of a decision finally made. This felt different, quieter, more like the feeling of setting something down that you've been carrying carefully for a very long time, and finally finding a place where it can rest without breaking. In London 3 weeks later, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Vivienne Laurent, not quietly. Nothing about Vivienne was quiet, including her departure, which was conducted with the particular dramatic efficiency of a woman who understands that timing is everything. She left the house on Grosvenor Street on a Tuesday with her belongings and her manager, and a letter for Julian that his housekeeper reported he read standing in the entrance hall with his coat still on. The contents of that letter were not something Adelaide ever learned in detail. What she learned through the chain of information that connected Hampshire to Yorkshire through her mother's network was that Vivienne had written 2 lines that reached Adelaide third hand, but with the quality of something essentially true. I fell in love with the Duke of Ravensmere. I find I don't know the man behind him, and I'm not certain he does either. Adelaide received this information on a Thursday morning through a letter from her mother, who had heard it from Mrs. Hatton, who had heard it from someone at a London dinner. She read it twice. She set it aside. She picked up the correspondence she'd been working on for the Lincolnshire estate. There was a tenant dispute in the eastern section that was going to require a site visit and a significant amount of careful listening, and she went back to work. She did not feel vindicated. She did not feel sad. She felt mostly the quiet recognition of a woman watching a complicated situation finally simplify itself into something she could see clearly. Julian was alone now. He was alone in the hall with his ledgers and his coal mine contracts and 67 families who were watching him very carefully to see what kind of man he would decide to become. He had no one to talk to who knew him before the title. He had thrown away the one person who had. And somewhere in Hampshire, in her childhood home, Adelaide Fairmont was writing letters and making plans and building something from the ruins of what she'd had. Something entirely hers. Something no one could take from her, something that was just beginning. The next morning, she received a letter from Constance Aldridge confirming that 2 of her Lincolnshire associates had expressed serious interest in Adelaide's services. The letter included names, dates, and one line that Constance added at the bottom in her precise, no-nonsense handwriting. "Word is getting around, my dear. I'd make sure you're ready for it." Adelaide set the letter on the desk. She felt the thing in her chest that she'd been carefully tending since May. The small, careful warmth of something new that is still too young to be called hope, but has all the essential qualities of it. She picked up her pen. She had work to do. The word did get around. Constance Aldridge had not been exaggerating when she wrote that line. Adelaide had taken it as encouragement and found over the following weeks that it was something closer to a warning. By the second week of August, she had 3 formal inquiries. By the end of the month, 5. By September, the number had reached 9, and Adelaide was sitting at her father's writing desk at 7 in the morning, working through correspondence before breakfast, because the hours after breakfast were already spoken for. The inquiries came from different places and different people, but they had a quality in common, a specific kind of desperation dressed in composed language. A baronet in Derbyshire, whose tenants had been in open dispute with his estate manager for 2 years. A widow in Shropshire managing 400 acres she'd inherited without preparation. A landowner in Cumberland, whose wool production had dropped 30% in 3 years, and who had been told by 3 different consultants that the problem was market pricing, when Adelaide could see from his letter that the problem was something else entirely. She took each inquiry seriously. She wrote back promptly with questions, not recommendations, not yet, because she had learned from 8 years at Ravensmere that the first answers you receive are rarely the real answers, and that the real answers live inside the questions that nobody has thought to ask. She asked about the people. Not just the land, not just the finances, the families, the histories, the disputes that predated the current owners, and had never been properly resolved. The responses she received told her everything she needed to know about which situations she could actually help. Her mother watched all of this with a quiet, alert attention that Adelaide recognized as Lady Beatrice at her most engaged, which is to say, the expression of a woman who is thinking 3 steps ahead and choosing not to say so until the 3rd step is necessary. "You're going to need help," Beatrice said one morning, appearing in the doorway of the study with a cup of tea. She sat on the desk without asking. "You cannot answer 9 inquiries, conduct site visits, manage the Lincolnshire situation, and see Clara twice monthly without someone to assist you." "I know." Adelaide did not look up from the letter she was reading. "I'm thinking about it. I have a suggestion." "You have a person in mind. Her name is Eleanor Marsh." Her mother sat in the chair across the desk, the chair that was becoming the position from which Lady Beatrice Fairmont conducted what Adelaide had come to think of as her quietly extraordinary campaign of support. "She is 28. She is the daughter of a solicitor in Bristol. She has been managing her family's accounts since her father's eyesight began failing, and she has a mind like a set of very well-organized filing cabinets." Adelaide set down the letter. "How do you know her?" Mrs. Hatton's niece worked alongside her at a charitable trust in Bath. Her mother lifted her teacup. "Eleanor is looking for work that is worth her time. She is too practical for drawing rooms, and too intelligent for the options currently available to a woman of her station." Adelaide thought about this for a moment. "Send her to me." Eleanor Marsh arrived the following Wednesday, and Adelaide knew within 20 minutes that her mother had understood something correctly. Eleanor was compact, precise, and had the particular gift of listening without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been, and more valuable than most people understood. She asked 3 questions during their conversation, and each question was so exactly the right question that Adelaide experienced the particular sensation of encountering a mind that works the way yours does, but from a different angle. "Can you travel?" Adelaide asked near the end of the meeting. "Frequently, if necessary." "It will be necessary." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "Then yes." They shook hands across the writing desk. Adelaide felt in that handshake the specific satisfaction of a problem solved before it had the chance to become a crisis. The Lincolnshire visit happened in the first week of September. Adelaide traveled with Eleanor, which immediately established a dynamic that served them both. Eleanor handled the correspondence and the scheduling and the particular logistics of 2 women conducting professional business in a world that had not entirely accustomed itself to women conducting professional business. While Adelaide handled the conversations, the listening, the careful navigation of situations that required understanding people more than they required understanding ledgers. Constance Aldridge met them at the Lincolnshire estate on a clear morning and walked them through the situation with the frank efficiency of a woman who had stopped performing helplessness approximately 30 years ago. The estate manager, a man named Greer, who had been at the property for 12 years and had developed the particular settled confidence of someone who has not been seriously questioned in a long time, accompanied them with the expression of a man who is not certain whether to be offended or frightened. Adelaide spent the first day asking questions and taking no visible notes, which unsettled Greer more than a ledger review would have. She asked about the 3 vacant tenant farms, not about the lease terms, but about the families who had held them before they went vacant. She asked about the drainage issue on the eastern section and listened carefully to Greer's explanation, and then asked him to take her to the place where the problem was most severe, at the drainage site. She crouched down and looked at the ground for a moment. Then she stood up and turned to Constance. "This isn't a drainage problem," she said. "It's a compaction problem from equipment that's been running the same route across the same ground for approximately 6 years. The drainage system is working exactly as it should. The water has nowhere to go because the soil can't absorb it." She looked at Greer. "When did you change the equipment rotation?" Greer stiffened. "We haven't." "When did you acquire the second threshing machine?" A pause. 1879. "And the route it uses?" Another pause. Longer. Constance was watching this exchange with the focused attention of a woman watching someone untangle a knot she'd been pulling at for 3 years. "Greer," Constance said in the voice she used when she'd finished being patient. "Answer the question. The route, it turned out, crossed the eastern section, had crossed it since 1879. 6 years of the same machinery on the same ground, and nobody had connected it to the drainage failure because nobody had asked the right question. 3 days' work with the right equipment, Adelaide told Constance that evening, and a rotation change that cost nothing but a conversation with the men operating the machinery. Constance looked at her. My estate manager has had 3 consultants through here in 2 years. I know. None of them found that. They were looking at the drainage system, Adelaide said. I looked at the people using the land. Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she did something Adelaide had not expected. She reached across the table and put her hand over Adelaide's for just a moment, a brief, deliberate gesture of solidarity. Whatever you're charging, Constance said, you should charge more. They were on the train back to Hampshire when Eleanor looked up from the correspondence she was organizing and said without preamble, You had a letter from Ravensmere this morning. The footman put it with the rest of the post. I didn't open it. Adelaide had not told Eleanor the full history. Eleanor was too professional to require it, and too perceptive to need it. She understood the essential outline. The Duchess of Ravensmere was now Adelaide Fairmont, building a professional life in Hampshire after a separation, and the details were the details. Thank you, Adelaide said, and took the letter from the stack Eleanor offered. It was not Julian's handwriting. It was Clara's. The letters were large and effortful. The handwriting of a 7-year-old who has been practicing not the printing of a child copying letters, but the deliberate cursive of a child who has decided that proper handwriting is worth the difficulty. Adelaide felt something in her chest shift and settle in the way it always did when Clara did something that revealed exactly the person she was becoming. Dear Mama, Clara had written, I hope you are well in Hampshire. I am well in Yorkshire. I helped Mrs. Dorset make biscuits on Thursday. Papa ate 4 of them, which I think is more than he usually does. He has been going to see Mr. Mallory. I heard him tell Haverford that the culvert is fixed and the Caldwells are planting their west field again. I do not know what a culvert is, but it sounds important. I miss you every day, but not in a sad way, because you told me missing is what love does when it cannot be in the room. I remember that. Your loving Clara. Adelaide read the letter twice on the train. Then she folded it and held it in her hands for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Good news? Eleanor asked without looking up from her work. Yes, Adelaide said. Very good news. Julian had gone to Thomas Mallory. Adelaide learned this not from Julian's letters, which had become shorter and more careful. The letters of a man watching his words, but from Thomas himself, who wrote in October with the update she had been waiting for, and had refused to anticipate too specifically, because anticipating it would have meant wanting it, and she had been very deliberate about what she allowed herself to want. Thomas's letter said he came. He came on a Tuesday morning without Haverford, without a solicitor, without anyone. He knocked on the kitchen door. He sat at the table. He asked about the culvert, and Thomas told him, and Julian listened without defending or deflecting. Then he asked about the Hargreaves family's situation with the mill lease, and Thomas told him that too. They talked for 2 hours. He asked me. Thomas wrote what it would take. I told him it wasn't about taking. It was about showing. He said he understood. I'm not certain he does yet, but I think he's beginning to. The following week, the first 7 families resumed paying their rents. Adelaide received this news and sat with it quietly. She was glad, not for Julian's sake, or not primarily for Julian's sake, but for those 7 families who had held their position for 5 months at real personal risk, and who deserved to have that risk resolve into something stable. She wrote to Thomas. She thanked him for his steadiness. She asked how the northern field was looking ahead of the autumn planting. She did not ask about Julian. She did not need to ask about Julian. What Julian was doing at Ravensmere was Julian's work now. She had said that to him in the study, and she had meant it. And the part of her that had once measured herself by his progress had been quietly, firmly redirected toward something else. October brought the county dinner that Adelaide had not planned to attend. Her mother had been invited. Lady Beatrice Fairmont was invited to every significant gathering in Hampshire and 3 adjacent counties by virtue of 30 years of carefully maintained relationships. The dinner was at the Harrogate estate, hosted by Lord and Lady Harrogate, and would include approximately 40 guests from across the region. It was precisely the kind of event that Adelaide in her previous life would have attended as the Duchess of Ravensmere, making careful conversation and representing her husband's interests. She attended as Adelaide Fairmont. She had been Adelaide Fairmont for 5 months now, and the name fit differently. Not tighter or looser than the Ravensmere name, but differently. The way a garment made to your own measurements fits differently from one made to someone else's. The dinner was unremarkable until after the meal, when the guests moved to the drawing rooms and Adelaide found herself in conversation with a man she had not expected to encounter. His name was Robert Ashford. Lord Ashford, 39 years old with a 12,000-acre estate in Northumberland, and the particular manner of a man who has learned to listen from necessity rather than temperament. He had lost his wife 4 years ago. He managed his estate himself without an estate manager because he had found that the people he hired either knew the land or knew the people, and he required someone who knew both. He had heard of Adelaide through Constance Aldridge. "She spoke very highly of you," Robert said. They were standing near the fireplace with their respective cups of tea, which was a particular kind of English proximity, close enough to talk privately, far enough to be entirely proper. "She said you found the problem in 48 hours that 3 consultants had missed entirely." "The problem was visible once you looked at the right things," Adelaide said. "Constance said you looked at the people rather than the land. The people are why the land matters." He was quiet for a moment, turning his teacup slightly in his hands. He had a solid, unhurried quality, not the calculated stillness of a man performing authority, but the natural stillness of someone who has simply stopped being in a hurry. "I have a situation in Northumberland," he said. "It's more complicated than a drainage issue." "They always are." The corner of his mouth moved. "It involves 2 tenant families who have been in conflict for 11 years. A mill contract that expired last year and hasn't been renewed because neither side will negotiate with anyone the other side has already spoken to. And an estate manager who is competent with numbers and genuinely hopeless with people." He paused. "Constance says you're the solution. I'm inclined to agree based on the drainage problem alone. But I'd want to discuss it properly." Adelaide looked at him steadily. "I'm not available until January," she said. "I have commitments in Derbyshire and Shropshire through December." "January is fine." He produced a card from his breast pocket, the kind of card that is prepared in advance by a man who came to this dinner with a specific purpose. "If you're willing." She took the card. She did not look at it immediately because she had learned over the past 5 months the value of not appearing to need the next thing before the current thing was finished. "I'll write to you," she said, "when my December commitments are confirmed." He nodded, and there was something in the nod, something that was simply respect, uncomplicated and direct, that Adelaide noticed without marking it as more than what it was. A professional courtesy, the acknowledgement of competence by someone who valued it. She moved on to the next conversation, but she kept his card. Julian arrived at Fairmont House on a Wednesday morning in November without warning. Adelaide was in the sitting room with Eleanor working through the Derbyshire correspondence, when the housekeeper appeared with an expression that told her everything before a word was spoken. "The Duke of Ravensmere is at the door, ma'am. He says it's a personal matter." Adelaide set down her pen. Eleanor looked up from the ledger, then looked immediately and deliberately back down at it. "Show him to the front sitting room," Adelaide said. "Tell him I'll be 5 minutes." She was 6 minutes she finished the sentence she was working on because finishing the sentence mattered, and because Julian Ravenscroft had arrived without announcement at her parents' house, and he could wait 6 minutes. He was standing when she came in. He did not sit until she did. He looked different. Not worse, not the haggard, sleepless quality she'd seen in August. He looked leaner somehow in a way that was not about weight, as if something had been stripped away that had been adding bulk without adding substance. "You should have written first," she said. "I know." A pause. "I wasn't certain I'd come if I gave myself time to think about it." That was honest enough that she let the unannounced arrival go. "Clara is well," he said. "She talks about you every day." "I know," She writes. She asked me to buy her a proper writing set, ink and everything. She's practicing her letters so that her mama will be impressed. The corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile. She already writes better than I did at twice her age. Adelaide let herself be glad about that openly. She's a remarkable person. She is. Julian's hands rested on his knees, not folded in the careful negotiating posture, just resting the hands of a man who hadn't prepared a position. I went to see Mallory again, last week. I heard. 34 families paying now. He paused. Not all of them, but 34. That's progress. It's slow. It was 8 years in the making, Adelaide said. Slow is appropriate. He looked at her. The look lasted long enough to be something beyond social convention, not romantic, not the look of a man making a plea, but the look of someone trying to see something clearly. I wanted to tell you, he said carefully, that you were right, about what I'd built and about the part I didn't build. He stopped, started again. I've been sitting at that kitchen table with Mallory and with Hargreaves and with the Caldwells, doing what you said, listening, not managing listening. He stopped again. It's harder than I expected. It's harder than it looks, Adelaide agreed. You made it look easy. I didn't. I just did it consistently, which is a different thing. She kept her voice steady, not unkind. Julian, why are you here? Not the official reason, the real one. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. Because I wanted to see with my own eyes that you're well, he said. Because I've been reading your name in letters from Constance Aldridge's circle and hearing it in conversations I'm not part of, and I wanted to... He stopped. I wanted to know that the thing I did to you didn't break something that shouldn't have been broken. Adelaide looked at him for a long time. She thought about the woman who had arrived in Yorkshire as a 26-year-old bride, who had spent 8 years learning a landscape and its people, and building something remarkable that no one had thought to name until it was gone. She thought about the woman who had sat at her father's writing desk at 7 in the morning and written careful letters to people who needed her particular kind of help. She thought about Eleanor Marsh and her well-organized mind, and Constance Aldridge and her sharp laugh, and Thomas Mallory and his kitchen table, and Robert Ashford and his card, and Clara's careful cursive, and her theory about missing people. I'm not broken, she said. I was never going to be broken by this. That was always a miscalculation on your part. Something shifted in Julian's face. Yes, he said quietly. It was. I'm building something, she said. It's early, and I won't tell you what it will become because I don't entirely know yet. But it's mine. It's built on what I know, and on 8 years of learning things I didn't know I was learning. She held his gaze. You didn't break anything. You freed it. Julian sat with that for a moment. She watched him absorb it, not with gratitude exactly, but with the particular kind of recognition that is its own form of pain. I'm glad, he said finally. And she believed him. She stood. He stood immediately. You should write before you come next time, she said. Clara's visit is the second weekend of December. If you'd like to coordinate so she can see us both without the travel being complicated, write to Eleanor, she manages my schedule. He nodded. He moved toward the door and then stopped. Adelaide. He did not turn around fully. The man I was before everything. The man you married. Do you think is there anything left of him? She considered the question honestly. I think, she said carefully, that he's the one sitting in Tom Mallory's kitchen, the one who showed up without a solicitor and listened for 2 hours. She paused. Whether he stays or not, that's up to you. Julian nodded once. He left. Adelaide stood in the sitting room and listened to the house settle around her, and she felt something she had not felt in the immediate aftermath of any of this. Not relief, not vindication, not the sharp edge of righteous anger. She felt the clean, quiet weight of a chapter that was ending properly, not happily necessarily, not wrapping itself into a neat resolution, but properly with honesty and acknowledgement and the particular dignity of people who have said the true things, even when the true things were difficult. She went back to the other room. Eleanor looked up. All right. Yes. Adelaide sat and picked up her pen. Where were we? Derbyshire. Eleanor turned a page in the ledger. The tenant dispute. Right. Adelaide looked at the letter in front of her. I think the solution is simpler than they've made it. Let me tell you what I'm thinking. December came with the particular quality of an English winter, not violent, but relentless, the kind of cold that settles into a house's bones and requires constant management. Adelaide managed it. She was good at managing things that required consistency. Clara's visit was 3 days the second weekend of December, and she arrived with her writing set and her music box, and a drawing she had made of Ravensmere that she presented to Adelaide with the seriousness of a significant gift. I drew it so you can remember it without being sad, Clara said. Adelaide looked at the careful, imprecise lines of a 7-year-old's attempt at a very large house, the lopsided towers, the garden that bore no resemblance to the actual garden. I love it, she said, and meant it completely. They spent 3 days reading and walking and sitting by the fire while Clara asked questions about Adelaide's work, about the estates she visited, about whether it was true that the Lincolnshire drainage had been caused by a machine going the same way too many times, because Papa had told her that story, and she wanted to make sure she understood it correctly. Adelaide explained it twice, and by the second explanation, Clara was nodding with the focused satisfaction of a child who has successfully processed new information and filed it properly. On the last evening, Clara fell asleep in the chair by the fire, still holding her music box, and Adelaide sat across from her and simply looked at her for a long time. Her daughter had Julian's eyes and Adelaide's patience. She had an absolute certainty about what mattered, which she expressed with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to qualify her convictions for social comfort. She was going to be formidable. Adelaide thought formidable in the specific way of women who are both intelligent and kind, and refused to see those qualities as opposites. She carried Clara to bed and tucked her in, and stood in the doorway for a moment. She thought about what Thomas Mallory had asked her in August. Enough that you look back and know you didn't just survive it, you built something from it. She looked at her daughter. She thought about Eleanor Marsh, and the Derbyshire estate, and the January appointment in Northumberland, and the 9 inquiries, and the women who were beginning to say her name to each other in drawing rooms across 3 counties. She thought about what it felt like to sit in a kitchen in Lincolnshire and see in 48 hours what 3 consultants had missed entirely. She thought about the particular feeling of competence, not the performance of it, not the management of it, but the lived experience of doing something you are genuinely good at, in conditions that are genuinely yours. She had not just survived. She was quietly, irrevocably building. And what she was building was hers, every piece of it, every letter and conversation, and carefully asked question and hard-won relationship. Nobody had given it to her. Nobody had taken it away when they tried to diminish her. It had been inside her the whole time, waiting for the space to become something real. She turned off the lamp in Clara's room. She walked down the corridor to her own room, to the desk where tomorrow's correspondence was already waiting, to the life that was day by careful day becoming exactly what she intended it to be. Outside, the Yorkshire moors were a memory now. Hampshire was home. And Adelaide Fairmont, not the duchess, not the wife, not the woman who had endured in silence. Adelaide Fairmont, who had built something extraordinary once, and was building something extraordinary again, on her own terms, in her own name, was exactly where she was supposed to be. January arrived, the way real change always does, not with announcement, but with the quiet insistence of something that has already decided to happen. Adelaide took the train north to Northumberland on the 7th of the month, with Eleanor beside her, and 2 cases of correspondence that represented between them the accumulated work of 6 months of building something from nothing. The Derbyshire situation had concluded in December, resolved through 3 visits, 11 conversations, and 1 letter that Adelaide had written to the disputing parties' respective solicitors that was so precisely calibrated that both men had written back within a week, agreeing to terms they had refused to consider for 2 years. Eleanor had framed that letter without being asked. It hung on the wall of the small office Adelaide had established in Fairmont House, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what careful language could accomplish when it was paired with genuine understanding. The Shropshire widow, Mrs. Prentice had written at Christmas with news that the 3 vacant farms on her estate had all been relet, 2 to families who had expressed interest 18 months ago and been given terms they couldn't accept, and 1 to a young couple whose situation Adelaide had identified during her site visit as exactly the kind of fresh start that struggling land sometimes needs. Mrs. Prentice's letter was 3 pages long and ended with a sentence that Adelaide read to Eleanor on the morning it arrived. "I have managed this estate for 4 years, and I have never once felt that someone understood both what it needed and what I was trying to do with it until now." Eleanor's response had been characteristic. "Good. We should raise our rates." Adelaide had laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes without preparation. "In the spring," she'd said. "Let me finish January 1st. Robert Ashford met them at the Northumberland station himself, which Adelaide had not expected. He had the look of a man who had been managing alone for long enough, that certain gestures, the ones that involve acknowledging that other people's time matters, had become natural rather than performed. "I appreciate you coming in January," he said as they walked to the waiting carriage. "I know it's not the easiest month for travel." "January is when the problems show themselves clearly," Adelaide replied. "Summer covers a great deal. Winter is honest." He glanced at her sideways. "That's an interesting way to look at it." "It's an agricultural truism dressed up as philosophy." She adjusted her traveling coat. "Tell me about the 2 families." He told her in the carriage, not the version he had told her at the Hampshire dinner, the summary version, but the full account, the one with details. The Warwick family and the Grayson family had farmed adjacent sections of the Ashford estate for 30 years. The dispute had begun in 1874 over a water source that both families used and neither had formal claim to, and had grown in 11 years into something that had consumed 3 estate managers, 2 solicitors, and the goodwill of approximately every other tenant family on the property who had been forced to take sides in a conflict they had no interest in. "The mill contract," Adelaide said when he finished, "expired last March. And neither family will negotiate because both believe the other will use any agreement as leverage in the water dispute." "Exactly. So the water dispute has to be resolved first. Every solicitor I've consulted has said the same thing." Robert's voice had the controlled frustration of a man who has heard the right answer repeatedly and still hasn't found a way to act on it. "The problem is that neither family will sit in the same room with a legal representative. They've tried it twice. Both times it ended before anything was accomplished." "They don't need a legal representative in the room," Adelaide said. "They need someone who isn't going to win or lose anything based on the outcome." She turned to look at him directly. "Who do they both trust?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not many people." "One person is enough. Think," he thought. The carriage moved through the January morning. Eleanor was making quiet notes without appearing to do so, which was one of her more valuable professional qualities. "Old Hadley," Robert said at last. "Samuel Hadley. He's been on the estate since before my father's time. He's 80 or near enough. Both families respect him. He was a kind of informal arbitrator on the estate for decades before his health declined." A pause. "He rarely leaves his house now." "Could we visit him today?" Robert looked at her. "You want to visit an 80-year-old man on your first afternoon. I want to understand the situation properly before I form any opinions about how to resolve it." She held his gaze. "That's how this works." He absorbed this. Then, "I'll send word ahead." Samuel Hadley was 81 years old, lived in a cottage at the estate's western edge, and had the particular quality of very old people who have decided to say exactly what they mean because they have no time remaining for anything else. He received Adelaide with the cautious assessment of a man who had seen enough well-intentioned visitors to know that intention and understanding were not the same thing. "You're the Fairmont woman," he said when she sat across from him. "Robert said you sorted the Lincolnshire drainage." "I asked the right questions," Adelaide said. "Same thing." He looked at her with eyes that were still sharp. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know what the water dispute is really about." Howe was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back and looked at the ceiling and said, Thomas Warwick's grandfather saved Arthur Grayson's grandfather from drowning in that stream in 1831. Arthur Grayson's grandfather never acknowledged it. He told the story differently to his family, told it as if he'd managed himself to safety. Thomas Warwick's family knew the truth, and the Graysons denied it for 50 years. The water source is just the most recent thing they've found to fight about. Adelaide sat very still. "Does anyone else know this?" she asked. "I do," Samuel said simply. "My father was there. He saw it." "Is there any record?" "My father wrote it in his diary. I have the diary." Adelaide looked at the old man across from her. She thought about the mill contract, and the solicitors, and the 11 years of conflict, and the 30-year history underneath it. And she thought about how many problems in the world were at their deepest point, about someone needing the truth to be acknowledged by the people who had denied it. "Mr. Hadley," she said carefully, "would you be willing to tell both families what your father saw, together in the same room?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm 81. I know. I've been waiting," he said slowly, "for someone to ask that question for approximately 30 years. He straightened in his chair. "Tell Robert to arrange it." Robert Ashford's reaction. When Adelaide told him what she'd learned was the reaction of a man encountering a dimension of his own estate that he had not known existed. "A drowning in 1831, he repeated. "That's what's underneath the water dispute, the mill contract, and 11 years of conflict." Adelaide poured tea from the service that had been waiting in Robert's study when they returned. The Grayson family has been defending a story their grandfather invented, and the Warwick family has been demanding acknowledgement for something that happened 50 years ago and was never given. Nobody who dealt with this dispute legally looked far enough back to find the actual wound. Robert was quiet for a moment. "And Hadley, he'll do it. He'll sit with both families." He said he's been waiting 30 years for someone to ask. She set down the teapot. "Arrange the meeting. Give me a week with the families before it. I want to talk with them separately first, so neither one arrives defensive." "You think that's possible, getting them to meet at all?" "I think they're both exhausted," Adelaide said simply. 30 years of inherited conflict is a weight that most people would happily put down if someone showed them a way to do it without losing face. She looked at him steadily. "That's what the meeting gives them. A story that makes them both in different ways right. The Warwicks get the acknowledgement. The Graysons get to reframe their grandfather's behavior as shame rather than malice." She paused. "People can live with complicated ancestors. What they can't live with is being told that the story they've carried is worthless." Robert looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize, not the professional assessment of a client evaluating a consultant, but something more direct and more personal than that. "You do this instinctively," he said. "Don't you?" "I do it carefully," she corrected. "There's a difference. Most people don't have either." She picked up her tea. "Arrange the meeting with Hadley, and find me somewhere to speak with Catherine Warwick privately tomorrow. I understand she's the one who carries the family's position." "She is." A pause. "She's also formidable." Good, Adelaide said. "Formidable people generally want resolution more than continuation. They're just waiting for a version they can accept." The week that followed was the most concentrated work Adelaide had done since leaving Ravensmere. She met with Catherine Warwick, a woman of 53, with the particular bearing of someone who has been right about something for so long that she has forgotten what it felt like to be unsure, and she listened for 2 hours before she said a single word about the dispute. What she heard in those 2 hours was grief dressed up as righteousness. The grief of a family that had watched a true thing be denied, generation after generation, until the denial itself had become the inheritance. She met with James Grayson, Catherine's counterpart in stubbornness and in suffering, and heard the same grief from the other side. The grief of a family that had defended a lie so long they had almost stopped knowing it was one. She did not tell either of them what Hadley had told her. Not yet. She asked about their families, their farms, their children. She asked about the mill, what it had meant to them when it was running, what the expiration of the contract had cost. She made no promises and offered no solutions. She simply listened in the way she had always listened, and by the end of each conversation, something in each person's posture had shifted just slightly, just enough. On Friday, Samuel Hadley sat in Robert Ashford's study with both families present. Adelaide stood to the side. This was not her moment. She had understood that from the beginning. She had built the conditions for it. What happened in it belonged to the people in the room. Hadley read from his father's diary, in a voice that was quieter than Adelaide had expected, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has held something for 80 years and finally has the right hands to give it to. He read the account of the drowning. He read his father's description of what he had seen and what he had heard afterward. He read the part where Arthur Grayson's grandfather had told the story differently, and he read it without judgment, as a fact, as something that had happened, as the beginning of a wound that had been passed down through 4 generations, without anyone having the means to close it. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Catherine Warwick was the first to speak. Her voice, when it came, had something in it that Adelaide recognized as the sound of a person setting down something very heavy. "Thank you," she said. To Hadley. To no one in particular. To the air in the room. James Grayson was quiet for a long time. Adelaide watched his face, the internal negotiation of a man confronting the distance between the story he had been given and the story that was true. "My grandfather," he said at last. He stopped. "He was not a bad man." "No," Hadley agreed. "He was a man who was frightened and ashamed, and he handled it poorly, and the handling became the family story." A pause. "These things happen to people. The question is what the people who come after do when they find out." James Grayson looked at Catherine Warwick. She looked back. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not yet. That would take longer. But the particular recognition of 2 people who have just discovered that the war they've been fighting was always underneath it all, about something that could have been resolved with a sentence. The mill contract was signed 6 days later. Adelaide was in Robert Ashford's study on the evening after the contract was signed, writing the report she would send to both families and to Robert himself, a document that recorded what had been done and why, so that the resolution had a clear foundation that future disputes couldn't erode. When Robert came in with 2 glasses of wine and set one on the desk beside her without asking. She looked at the glass, then at him. "Thank you," she said, and kept writing. He sat in the chair across the desk, the guest chair, the same position across from a desk that had been in Adelaide's experience the position of honesty. He waited until she finished the paragraph. "Constance Aldridge wrote to me," he said when Adelaide set down her pen. "She said that what you did in Lincolnshire was the clearest thinking she'd seen applied to estate management in 30 years. Constance is generous. She's accurate." He turned his wine glass slightly. "What you did this week finding Hadley understanding what the dispute was actually about, building the conditions for that conversation, that's not consulting. That's something else." Adelaide looked at him. "What would you call it?" "Leadership," he said. "The kind that doesn't announce itself." She considered the word. It landed differently than she expected, not as flattery, but as description. As the name for something she had been doing for a long time, without a name for it. "I have a proposal," Robert said. His voice shifted fully, deliberately, into something more deliberate than professional conversation. "Not about the estate." Adelaide went still. "I'm aware," he said, "that this is possibly premature, and I'm aware that you are building something that is yours, and that you are doing it exactly as you should be, and that you have no reason to complicate that." He paused. "But I think you should know that I have found in the past week that I would like to continue being in the same room as you. Not as a client, as something else." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had built in 7 months. She thought about Eleanor and Constance and Thomas Mallory and Clara's careful cursive, and the afternoon she had sat in Julian's empty study and looked at 8 years of ledgers and decided what her life was worth. She thought about what she had promised herself, not as a vow of solitude, not as a rejection of connection, but as a commitment to never again allowing herself to be in a position where her presence was taken for granted. "I appreciate your honesty," she said carefully. "I'm not asking for an answer now." He met her eyes directly. I'm asking for the opportunity to be known, properly, in the way that takes time. A pause. I think you understand the difference between that and a declaration. She did understand. That was exactly the difference. I'm in Northumberland until the end of the month, she said. I have a full schedule. I know. I eat dinner at 7. Howe was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved that small, unhurried shift that she had noticed at the Hampshire dinner and had not forgotten. 7 is convenient, he said. She picked up her pen. The letter from Julian arrived in the 3rd week of January, forwarded from Hampshire to Northumberland by Eleanor's efficient hand. It was the longest letter Julian had written her since the marriage had ended 4 pages in his angular handwriting, and Adelaide read it on a Thursday morning with her tea going cold beside her. He wrote about Ravensmere, about the tenants' 89 families now paying 11 still holding, and Julian's account of this was not defensive but honest in a way. His letters had become gradually more capable of. He wrote about sitting with the Hargreaves family when their youngest was sick, and finding to his own surprise that he had stayed longer than the visit required, because there was something in that kitchen, the ordinary life of it, the trust of people who let you into their difficulty, that he had not known he was missing until he was inside it. He wrote about the culvert repair which Thomas Mallory had overseen, and about standing in the North Field afterward with Mallory in the cold, and shaking the man's hand properly for the first time. Then in the 4th page he wrote the thing Adelaide had not expected. He wrote, I have been thinking these past months about what you said to me in the study, that you freed something when you left. I have been trying to understand what that means from where I stand, which is from the position of the person who made the cage. I think what I understand now is that I built something magnificent and called it a home, and the difference between those two things is exactly what you were and what I failed to recognize. A home is not something you build. It is something you are given by the people who choose to stay in it. I did not understand the difference until I lost the proof of it. Then Clara is well. She has informed me that she intends to manage an estate when she grows up, but not a sad one. I told her I agreed completely. She said, Papa, all you have to do is listen. She is 7 years old, and she is correct, and I will spend a long time making peace with the fact that it took losing you for me to hear it. Adelaide set the letter down. She sat for a long time with her cold tea and the January light, and the sound of the Northumberland estate going about its mourning. She thought about Julian, not about the marriage, not about the loss of it, but about the man who had stood in the chapel and said she was the one person who saw him before the title. She thought about whether that man was coming back, and whether it mattered to her now if he did. It mattered that he was becoming someone Clara could respect. It mattered that 89 families on his estate were living with more fairness than they'd had before. It mattered that the man who had believed loyalty was a product of reward was learning slowly and at real cost that it was a product of something else entirely. Whether it mattered to her personally as anything beyond that, she examined the question carefully, the way she examined everything without hurry or illusion. No, it didn't, not anymore. She picked up her pen and wrote back. 2 pages warm and honest. She told him Clara had said the same thing to her. All you have to do is listen, and that she believed Clara was right, and that she was glad he was hearing it. She told him about the Northumberland situation, because he would find it professionally interesting, and because the time for pretending their lives were entirely separate was past. She told him that she hoped genuinely that Ravensmere would continue to recover. She did not tell him about Robert Ashford. That was hers. It was early and uncertain, and she had no idea what it would become, and it was entirely, completely hers. She sealed the letter. She sent it. Then she went back to work. The last week of January brought a letter from Constance Aldridge that contained folded inside it a clipping from a London society paper. Adelaide unfolded it with mild curiosity and found a short item, the kind of brief social notice that English newspapers ran about minor developments in the aristocratic world, that described in 3 sentences the establishment of the Fairmont Estate Consultancy, with a note that it had recently completed work in Lincolnshire, Derbyshire, Shropshire, and most recently, Northumberland, and that inquiries could be directed to Miss Eleanor Marsh in Hampshire. Constance had written in the margin in her sharp, decisive hand, You've arrived, my dear. Now the letters will really start coming." Adelaide stared at the clipping for a moment. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time, something she had not felt entitled to do in the years of the marriage, because she had been so occupied with being useful that she had forgotten to also be proud of herself. She felt proud, not the careful, managed pride of a woman who has survived something. The clean, unguarded pride of a woman who has built something, who has taken the years of quiet competence that went unacknowledged, and the 8 months of deliberate, disciplined rebuilding, and the particular painful education of being underestimated by someone who should have known better and made from all of it something real. She showed Eleanor the clipping. Eleanor read it. "The rate increase," she said immediately. "Spring is too late. We're doing it in February." Adelaide laughed. It was the same real laugh as before, the kind that comes without preparation, the kind that belongs to a woman who has stopped being careful about everything. "February," she agreed. On the last morning of January, Adelaide rode the Ashford estate alone. It was cold and bright, the kind of morning that Northumberland specializes in, the air, sharp enough to feel like something the land open in every direction. She had borrowed a horse from Robert's stables, a steady animal with good sense, and she rode the eastern boundary, first and then north, covering ground that she had walked during the week's work, seeing it now from a different angle. She thought about Ravensmere, about the rides she had taken in all weather, in all seasons, 8 years of learning a landscape until she knew it the way you know something you love. She thought about the morning she had left the estate gates, the last field, the sound of the carriage wheels on the road. She did not feel grief about it. She felt instead the particular sensation of distance, not separation, but perspective. The difference between being inside something and being far enough away from it to see its shape. What she had been at Ravensmere was indispensable. What she had not been was free. Those two things had lived side by side for 8 years without her fully seeing them, and it had taken losing one to discover the value of the other. She was no longer indispensable to Ravensmere. She was building indispensability of a different kind, the kind that was distributed across many places and many people, the kind that didn't require her to be invisible to function, the kind that had her name on it. She turned the horse and rode back. Robert was in the yard when she arrived. He took the horse's bridle while she dismounted, a practical gesture, the gesture of a man who is comfortable being useful without making it significant. "Good ride?" he asked. "Clear morning." She handed him the reins. "I've been thinking about your east boundary. The drainage survey we recommended. I want to look at the equipment rotation before I finalize the report." He looked at her. "Is that what you were thinking about?" She met his eyes. "Among other things." The corner of his mouth, that small, unhurried movement. "Among other things," he agreed. She walked past him toward the house, toward Eleanor, and the correspondence, and the February rate increase, and the 10 letters that had arrived from new inquiries in the past 2 weeks, and the life that was every day becoming more fully what she had intended it to be. She had loved Julian Ravenscroft. She had given him 8 years of her best self, and she had been right to love him, and she had been right to leave him, and both of those things were true, without contradiction. She was 35 years old. She had a daughter who intended to manage estates that were not sad. She had a consultancy with a name in a London newspaper. She had a mind that understood people and land, and the complicated essential work of making communities function with fairness and dignity. She had Eleanor's well-organized filing cabinet of a brain, and Constance Aldridge's sharp laugh, and Thomas Mallory's kitchen table, and old Samuel Hadley's father's diary, and the Warwick and Grayson families, who were right now figuring out how to be neighbors after 30 years of being enemies. She had, in short, built exactly what she had set out to build when she sat in Julian's empty study and looked at 8 years of ledgers and decided that her life was worth more than a silence that passed itself off as peace. A powerful man had cast her aside. 100 families know 89 now, and the 11 remaining would come, because people who have been shown what honesty looks like tend in the end to move toward it, had refused to go with her, and Adelaide Fairmont, Duchess of Nothing, owner of everything that actually mattered, walked into the house and picked up her pen and went to work. The work was hers. The life was hers. And no one not ever again would make her forget what either of those things was worth.